Guys, I'm really excited. Colossians has a lot to say. My hope is that if it comes back to me in another 4 weeks, we're going to dive back into Colossians because I think that it's always good to repeat, go back and be reminded. But we would look at Colossians too. But be on the lookout for next week, or for next Monday. I think a little bit later today, we're going to decide um, who's given the next devo and what that'll be on. So we don't have that right now, but we'll get that out in just a little bit. Um, so I'm going to go ahead and just dive in for you guys that are here. Of course, I think what can happen is this will be posted, and if anyone missed it, they can go back and watch and start watching from, I guess, the 7 minute and 45-second mark. But the reason I wanted to dive into um, Colossians is because there's a really neat context that sets up this letter to have a big gospel impact on our lives. Paul, the first thing is Paul is writing this letter while in prison, and so you see that a couple of times in Colossians, and he expresses several times how he wishes he could be with this Colossian church, and I think that that's somewhat our cry right now, is that we want to be together. But even in the midst of that imprisonment, his focus, especially in this book, is on the supremacy and sufficiency of Jesus, which is crazy enough. But if I had to summarize the book of Colossians in a phrase, it would be this: Jesus is enough. Or to put it from another angle, Jesus is better. And Jesus is better than enough. Paul is writing this letter because the Christians in Colossae are, in one sense, struggling to accept the simplicity of the gospel. There was this false teaching that was going around that said Jesus wasn't sufficient, Jesus wasn't enough. You had to have Jesus and something else. Maybe some Jewish tradition were seeping back in, maybe some Greek Hellenistic mysticism that was influential in the day, or maybe some ultra spirituality apart from Jesus. And I think we can get drawn into that too sometimes. We can forget about the simplicity of Jesus, of the gospel of Jesus. And this was leading the Christians, and can lead us to doubt certain aspects of God's sovereignty and salvation through Jesus and Jesus alone. I don't know about you, but it may be times like this, particularly, that bring about confusion and doubts and even despair or anxiety. And maybe it isn't right now, but when life does get out of control, guys, when we're faced with the reality that we have no ultimate say in life, we can begin to question our beliefs in things like God's sovereignty and his supremacy. Supremacy meaning his ultimate authority above all others. Colossians speaks into this with a clear message. And so I want to dive into this by looking in chapter 1, starting in verses 9 and 10. I'm going to read that for us now. And so, from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. Paul starts chapter 1 with a thanksgiving and prayer, and this knowledge and wisdom and understanding that he's praying for is ultimately to serve Jesus, not ourselves. It's ultimately to please God and not man. And that's starting to set us up for the rest of the book. But he continues in verses 12 through 14 saying this: giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. And here he begins setting up the rest of the book. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. So Paul is setting up the rest of this letter by reminding them and reminding us whose we are and what we have. We belong to this beloved Son. We have redemption, the forgiveness of sins in him. And that's pretty much what the rest of the letter is going to be about. And so we turn to the next, in my book, page, but in the next section, where he just goes on a beautiful hymn of who this Jesus is. Who is this beloved Son? And this is who he is. If you want to follow along, I'm not going to read the exact wording, but I made a list here that essentially is what Paul's saying about Jesus. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of creation, the one who created all things, the reason all things were created, the one before or above all things, the one who holds all things together, the head of the body, the church, the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, the first place in everything, the fullness of God, the reconciler of all things, the peacemaker. This list is just an exhaustive list of praises, or a not exhaustive, really, list of praises and just exaltation of Jesus. And guys, that is Jesus. That is our Jesus who we belong to. And if we had time, I'd ask us to dwell on that a little bit more. And in fact, later today, and even just after this, take some time to read that list again and and just marvel in it, because what Paul says next is mind blowing. Look at verses 21 and 22 of chapter 1. And you, who once were alienated and hostile in mind and doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. Guys, if you are in Christ, we stand blameless. We stand holy. We are above reproach before this incredible God man that Paul just put on display. That is a huge and you. It's kind of like in Romans when you read but God. Here you read and you. You are in on this. You belong to this God, this man. But Paul continues in verse 23, and this is where we're going to end. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. This is not a conditional salvation that Paul's talking about. He's not saying only if you continue to believe and you hold fast your strength and it's saving yourself. What Paul is saying here is he's calling the Colossians and he's calling you and I to remember our hope in this Jesus, and to remain steadfast. In reality, he's saying, hang on to this, because this is what's holding on to you. Um, remember that. Remember that Jesus is better. I'm going to finish by reading a quote from Paul David Tripp in this New Morning Mercies. It's for January 23rd, and he uh, writes at the very beginning of the devotional, and he says this: "Hope is not a thing, not a location, not a situation, not an experience. Hope is a person, and his name is Jesus." And guys, what the book of Colossians is telling us, and what Paul is telling us, is that Jesus is better, better than anything you can imagine. And whatever you're going through, Jesus is enough. So thank you guys for hanging out with me for a little bit. Hopefully, this first devotion is something that you guys felt encouraging, and hopefully that we'll be able to see you in small groups and things like that. Keep an eye out for announcements that are going out. But just remember, guys, in this crazy season of life, Jesus is enough, and we can find rest, and our hope is in Jesus, not in anything else but this person of Jesus. So, see you guys around.